dun. Got to share my screen, haven't I? Can you see my screen, Kashi?
Yeah, all good.
Cool. So let's get going. Hello, everyone. Happy New Year. My name is Matt Phelan. I'm your host today. I am from the Happiness Index. I'm co-founder and co-CEO. Today, we've gathered everyone today to discuss what I think is personally an incredibly important subject. The title today is The Last Workplace Taboo, Personal Relationship Stress. I'm joined today from a group of people from OnePlusOne. I'll be representing the Happiness Index and asking our experts today lots of questions to help us all learn. So I'll be joined today by Claire Murray, Verity Glasgow, and Shannon Hurst. A bit before we get into that, the Happiness Index is an employee engagement and happiness platform. What does that actually mean for companies that want to, rather than just say their people is their greatest asset and actually prove it? It's a way of understanding how your people think, feel, and behave. So over time, you can build what we would describe as a thriving culture. That's the Happiness Index. In terms of the subject that we're talking today and where it sits within our neuroscience model, this is what we call our hierarchy of happiness and engagement. On the left is all the drivers of happiness. On the right is the drivers of engagement. So for the context of today, we're obviously going to be talking about relationships. Relationships sit in the emotional side of our data. When we talk about relationships at work, we also talk about personal relationships, energetic connections, and team dynamics. So I just wanted to give everyone a bit of a context about where we are in terms of the model that feeds through into the data. So let's get rid of this slide. Let's stop the share and let's bring everyone back. Hey, everyone. Look at this team. We've got a team of experts here today. I'm going to go around the room and get everyone to introduce themselves. Claire, can I go with you first, please?
Yes, hello, I'm Claire Murray. So I'm a relationship psychologist, so I work with couples, but I'm also an organisational psychologist. So I do a lot of coaching at London Business School and private consulting work. So my main area of interest and expertise is helping individuals and teams build better, strong, trust-based relationships in order to build a kind of trust-based culture and help collaboration and creativity, using my ideas from couple therapy.
Thanks, Claire. And what makes you happy?
Dancing.
Dancing, good answer. No, brilliant. Straight to the point. Verity, I'm going to ask you to introduce yourself, but also if you could introduce your organisation as well. I think that would be useful for context for our listeners.
Sure. Yeah. Hi, I'm Verity, and I am Chief Exec of OnePlusOne. I am completely and utterly passionate about relationships and all things relationships because they cut through everything that we do and they affect us all in our everyday lives. And obviously my job at OnePlusOne is to keep us kind of on our vision and on our mission as a charity that we are. So we're an early intervention relationship support charity. We've actually been going for 50 years, which...
Wow, I didn't know it was that. I didn't know it'd been going that long.
Founded
amazing,
50 years ago. And 50 years ago, we were talking about early intervention in relationships, and we're still talking about it now. So we were progressive, but it also tells us it's a really hard nut to crack that we're talking about, you know, the last taboo here now. Research into practice is at our core. So we look at understanding relationship breakdown on, let's say, adult mental health, on children's well-being, and we apply that research to the resources that we develop and the training that we do for practitioners. So really we turn the kind of really difficult to understand relationship science into something that people can use and understand in their daily lives.
I love that. So you're translating the science into everyday language that we can all use. That's
absolutely
so brilliant, Verity. We need to know what makes you happy before we kick off and move over to Shannon.
Oh yeah. What makes me happy? I have lots of things, but I think being present. I think it's so hard to like have all your attention, or it's easy to have your attention drawn all the time to other things. But being present with my family, with my friends, and spending time with them, just concentrating on them, that makes me really, really happy.
I love that, Verity. Last but not least, Shannon.
Hey, I'm Shannon Hurst. I'm the Senior Research Lead at OnePlusOne. So my background is relationship research, so research into kind of pro-social behaviours and relationships, particularly forgiveness. And at OnePlusOne, I do all things research, from kind of evidence reviews to kind of co-production to research design and evaluation. So big part of that is putting research into practice. So kind of actually speaking to the people who use our interventions and understanding how that impacts them. And yeah, how we can make things better, make people's lives better, hopefully.
Shannon, can you bring that to life for us? Like, you know, when you talk about an intervention and an impact, yes, could you sort of like bring that into the everyday? So for those that don't know the organisation, what that may actually look like or manifest in real life, please?
Yeah, of course. So we develop digital interventions for at the moment mostly for families, mostly for parents, to improve their ability to communicate and resolve conflict in their relationships. We use a combination of like relationship science, behavior change theory, behavior modeling training to teach people kind of core relational capability skills. So, and we kind of cover different transitional periods. So one of the interventions we have is called Me and Baby 2, and that is for people in the transition to parenthood. And it kind of does all that, you know, what to expect when you're expecting. Your relationship will change, that you will experience stress, and then how to cope with that, how to talk about that to your partner. You know, when things are breaking down, when you're not really communicating very well, what can you do to make that better? And using like BMT videos to show people the skills. So not just giving people evidence and text, but, you know, really making it accessible, videos, animations, interactives, things like that.
It's so important. I remember when we were waiting for my daughter to arrive, and I remember there was just so little research and books out, like, and even as like to prepare you to be a dad. I just remember reading this book, and pretty much the whole book just said maybe you shouldn't go down the pub 7 nights a week. That's pretty much the advice it gave. So I can vouch for how such an important area this is. Yeah. I suppose, Shannon, it's probably a good place to open the conversation up with a data question, which we've got a lot of listeners who love their data as well, which is how many people suffer from relationship stress or breakdown in the UK?
Yeah, so relationship breakdown is a really difficult one to kind of answer, because nobody's actually collecting the full source of that data. The ONS collects data on divorce, and, you know, statistics get bandied around that I think it's like 47% of marriages end in divorce, which sounds scarily high, but that's also considering that's over a lifetime of marriages. If you take like a 10-year period point, at the moment it's about 18% of marriages end by the 10th year anniversary. So not as scarily high as everyone likes to point out, but relationship breakdown is common. We do also know that just under half of children live in households with both parents. Children under 16 live in households with both parents. So that could be cohabiting parents rather than married. So yeah, relatively high, you know, but not as high as I think we're all led to believe when people are getting married in terms of divorce.
Yeah, and I suppose that's the second part, is the breakdown, isn't it? But even if I think of my own friendship group, how many people suffer from relationship stress? I don't know anyone. I would say presumably it's 100%, isn't it? Like the first part of the question.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I read a statistic relatively recently that said 1 in 3 people report relationship stress as an external stress in their life. So 1 in 3.
Interesting. So on to the next question. What are the triggers that can drive relationship cost? For example, cost of living crisis, we're talking about a lot at the moment, becoming a parent. Shannon, you mentioned menopause is something we've covered on here before. What are the normal triggers in relationship stress?
All of those things. All of those things. Transition to parenthood. Work is a huge one. Work is a big stress on people's relationships. Worklessness and poverty as well. It was, I think, parents under 16, so for transition to parenthood, so people under 16, again, they're more likely to live in homes where relationships are distressed and relationship satisfaction decreases massively in the first 2 years. I think you're 3 times more likely to live in a family with conflict if one of the parents is out of work, or if you experience poverty in the home. a child having a SEN is another kind of, parents where a child has a SEN is an additional stress as well.
Yeah.
Infidelity, career transitions, any of those things. And there's, you know, plenty of statistics and numbers I can bore people with.
We love statistics and numbers. Can we just bring can you just explain SEN for the acronym?
Yeah,
for listeners, please.
So special educational needs. So that can be any kind of additional support need that a child might have.
Yeah, Claire, I think this is a good point to bring you in. Any comments on what Shannon has sort of opened up there for us?
Absolutely, all those things that Shannon mentioned. But I think, you know, in terms of when we're working with a couple, the client is the relationship, and I think sometimes some of these areas, what we have to remember is that as we go through life, we as individuals are constantly evolving. Hence, the relationship is constantly evolving. So sometimes, you know, quite often in my work, and I see people who are at crisis point, and they say, he or she are not the person I married, because of course we all change. So it's understanding that relationships are fluid, that they're messy, that you know, they bring out the real kind of childlike part of ourselves, but also to acknowledge that things like connection are really important. So I was just talking to Verity and Sharon the other day. I had a couple. I've got two examples actually. One couple who I just finished a lovely piece of work with, who had 3 young children, one of whom had just been diagnosed with ADHD. Their middle son was waiting to be assessed for some other special educational needs, and they were really at crisis point because they were so stressed as parents that then there had been little time for them to focus on the couple. So this idea that we have to invest time and energy in the relationship, much like we do, you know, investing time with our friendships, but people often forget or assume, it's almost a kind of assumption that we don't have to do anything and it will just happen. But of course it doesn't. So life stage, becoming a parent, transitioning, that all has an impact. And I think, you know, what's really highlighted how important connection relationships are was the pandemic. When people were actually forced into isolation. And I worked with a couple, actually, I'm still working with them, who approached me about a year ago. They've been together 20 years, strong relationship, no children. They've been trying, unfortunately that hadn't happened, had some IVF. But then lockdown happened. They were both working in separate rooms, and they were together 24/7. And it transpired then that he'd started to have some kind of written communication with a colleague that he didn't really know very well, which ended up developing into an affair, which his wife found out about, which of course was devastating. But when you try and unpick, a lot of it was that he felt really isolated and trapped, that going to work and relationships with his work colleagues were really important to him. And in a way, you know, the affair was kind of a symptom of his unhappiness.
Claire, I remember a celebrity talking about the type of work that you do a couple of years ago, and he went through couples therapy, and he said in the article, I can't even remember what celebrity it was, said, now I've been through couples therapy, I believe that everyone should have couples therapy. That's kind of what I think is having a coach. Like I have a coach at work, and I feel like everyone should have a coach. Like, what's your view on that, Claire?
Yeah, I absolutely agree, because I think, you know, and some of that we may pick up a bit later, but it's really hard for couples to, so successful couples are creative, but they're also able to reflect or take a step back from the relationship. And I think sometimes what happens is we get stuck in, and, you know, like you say, having a work coach gives you the space to sort of think about, how am I behaving at work? How am I as a leader? Yada, yada. And then I think almost like a check-in, you know, with a couples therapist, or, you know, maybe once every few months, just to see how we're doing. So having that reflective space, just to stop, slow down, where are we? Because often what happens is couples end up in crisis without even realizing they're getting to crisis point. And by that point, you've got a build-up of resentment, which is the biggest killer in any relationship. It's not hate, which is the opposite of love. It's resentment and indifference. And once people disconnect or switch off or disengage, then it's much harder to build up to something more positive.
Thanks, Claire. Verity, I just want to bring you in actually, and just want to use your chief exec role for a second. Because one thing, the things I observe at the Happiness Index is because we study happiness and we understand the drivers of happiness, it definitely helps my own happiness because I understand it. So when you're at OnePlusOne and you're leading the team, you're obviously talking, and you've got people like Shannon talking about this information all the time. Do you observe that it helps people outside of their work having this information, and it happens to be your work as well? Does it help your employees? I'm just interested, really.
Yeah, no, I mean, we often say, in team meetings, like, oh God, thank goodness we do this job, because our relationships really benefit from this. But also the three of us were discussing this the other day as well, that even though this is our everyday, talking about decline in relationships, transition to parenthood. Some of us have got small children, that kind of thing. We still find some of those things that we kind of say you need to do difficult because, we if we're stressed, if we're stressed at home or stressed at work, it's harder to be present. It's harder to be able to kind of stop, listen, hear it from the other person's point of view. And all of those things, but yeah, I mean, definitely my partner, he's really pleased that I do this job because he feels that he's learning a lot all the time. But also when we interview people and it's because of what we do, they then open up, and there's a culture of being able to talk about things not being great in your relationship, because we generally only talk about things when they're really fantastic and you're getting together and it's like that honeymoon period and you're really open with your relationship chat at that point, and then you're really open about things when they're awful and you're bad mouthing the person and you're in, your relationship is ending and it's broken down. But we don't talk about that really, really important stuff in between where we all argue, and one of our interventions, we call it How to Argue Better, because we're going to argue. It's part of communicating. And also it's important for our children to see us kind of have that argument and then bring it to an end and see how that works between us. So yeah, I definitely personally benefit from it for sure.
Yeah. And in terms of, obviously a taboo's a taboo until people just talk about it, isn't it? And that's the subject today. If a chief exec is listening of their organization and they're starting to think, oh, is this work stuff? Is it not? Like, I love that point, Verity, that if it's impacting people, it's going to impact their performance at work. We know that from our happiness data. If you're unhappy at home, you're unhappy at work, and it flows the other way as well. If you were trying to encourage a CEO to break down the taboo, any tips on where they could start? Because for you, it's normal. This is just your product and what you talk about. But what about someone if this isn't what they normally talk about? Any advice somewhere to start, Verity?
That's such a good question. I mean, I think really it's being open and creating that culture of being able to talk about your relationships and what's going on. And I think probably creating that openness is about you being open yourself. And that's not about, there's so much attached to relationships that isn't attached to some of these other difficult conversations that we have. We talk about creating a culture where you can talk about mental health or you can talk about menopause. With relationships, and particularly relationship distress, there's a lot of shame attached to that, and personal shame. I failed, my relationship's not going well, I failed. So I think creating an openness in terms of the way that you talk about things in that culture and having an open mind, and I think that comes from you. I really do. I think that comes from you. And I think also all of the other things that we need in terms of creating a space to listen, and being kind of acceptance. So in acceptance, it might be providing some practical support to people who, if they're going through a separation, might need some time off because they're sorting out, picking up their kids at a different time. So there's lots of practical things that you can do to create that more open culture around talking about relationships. But it's really, number one is about changing the culture. But we're talking about changing the culture within the workspace. We need to change the work culture outside of the workspace, because we don't talk about relationships openly outside of the workspace either.
I had a neuroscience, Clive was talking about this yesterday, because we obviously talk about work-life balance, and by obviously separating work and life, is work is life.
Yeah.
For some people, they enjoy their work, some don't, and so on. But you can't say life is the thing that is outside of work. It's all. Claire, Shannon, anything you want to add to that particular subject before we go on?
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think work has become life so much more since the pandemic. And I've noticed I do a lot of work with a career transitioning service where they're kind of senior leaders in big organisations that either get made redundant or the organisation's restructured. So I see them at that point do some profiling. And it's really interesting. I've worked for this company for about 8 years. And over the last sort of 4 years, I've said, look, they've allowed me to work with the couple, because when there is a career transition, it doesn't just impact the individual, it impacts the couple and the family. So I think more and more now we're seeing work integrated with life as a result of the pandemic. Yeah.
Thanks, Claire. Shannon, in terms of understanding our own stress triggers, anything you can talk to us about that, like as the individuals that are listening, what can we tune into in our own bodies and minds to sort of understand these triggers?
Gosh, yeah, understanding your own stress triggers and those of your partner as well is super important. So understanding that, you know, stress it affects you physically, it affects you psychologically, you know, anything from lack of sleep to you know, foggy brain, forgetfulness, headaches, grinding your teeth, all of those kinds of those physical and psychological triggers that you have. It's really important to identify those in yourself, because it helps you understand your behavior better, because, you know, stress ultimately affects your behavior, doesn't it? It ultimately affects, you know, how short-tempered, and as Verity was saying, that you can't really be present, and if, you know, being present with people is so important. But it's really important to understand your partner's stress triggers as well, kind of understanding what's really going on, like understanding what it looks like on you, but also your partner. And as well as, I think, understanding your stress triggers, because, you know, if you understand this is going to make me stressed, these are the things I can put in place to cope with it. So if you understand your stress triggers, it can allow you to understand, right, what are my demands? What are the things that are going to be causing me stress? And what are the things I can use to cope? And sometimes those things are your relationship. Sometimes your relationship is your demand, and sometimes your relationship is your resource. And I think it's really important to be aware of that and to balance those things.
How do we square that with behaviors then? I'd love just anyone to come in on this subject, because that's a really good point, isn't it? If we know that stress changes behavior, but let's say as an organization we've set out our values around what is acceptable behavior or whatever, but what you're describing there, Shannon, is a much more empathetic way of looking at someone's behavior. So let's say someone has something serious going on at home, but they bring that to work, and their behavior leads someone else in the workforce to not feel great. How do we have that conversation? Because the behavior that someone may exhibit may seem over the top to someone, but they may be driven by a trigger somewhere else. How do we sort of square those conversations? I know this is a really tough question, and I feel like Verity might have an answer on it, but how do we have these conversations at work? Because how someone's behaving could be impacted from loads of different places, and we can't just put stuff into good and bad, presumably.
I hate to pass the bat here, but Claire actually had a really good point on this when we were talking about this the other day. We literally talked about individual differences and how people cope with stress. So
brilliant.
I won't take her response.
So a lot of work that I do with businesses, it was sort of individual profiling, is helping people to understand what happens when they're under pressure. Okay, so some people, if we're talking about the classic fight, flight, freeze response, some people retreat, so they might disengage. Some people might get, as we've heard, more short-tempered, more angry. Their reaction may be inappropriate to the situation, as you said, Matt, so can make someone else feel not great. So some of that, I think, is just adopting a more kind of understanding, psychologically safe space where you can have a one-to-one conversation and say, look, you know, in the classic feedback process, look, when we observed your behavior, you did X, Y, Z, and it had the impact of X, Y, Z. So trying to helping the person understand the impact of their behavior, and then, you know, underneath that, where does that come from? You know, it isn't like you, this is unusual. So a lot of I've noticed now over the past sort of 5 to 10 years, people are using things like psychometric tests. I use the Hogan profiles to understand how am I day to day, but also how am I when I'm under pressure. When you take that into a couple context, it may be, we were talking, the three of us the other day, you know, stress is so individual a response and how we deal with things. And as I'm sure you know from your neuroscience research, Matt, that, you know, our perceptual focus narrows. We go fight, flight, freeze. It's quite similar to grief, actually. It's a very individual response. So one partner may need to retreat, and another partner, the other partner, may actually need the connection or the attention more. So when you've got that tension between what I need when I'm stressed, so neither partner gets what they need, it makes it also really difficult to empathize. And empathy is absolutely critical in that couple relationship. When you're able to use the relationship as a source of support and comfort, I need to know that my partner understands me and what I'm going through. And when you're polar opposite in terms of your stress responses, that makes it difficult.
I think I just want to pull out for the audience. There's at least 25 nuggets in that, Claire, but I want to pull out a couple that you've said there. I think also the freeze point. Lots of people talk about fight or flight, but freeze is not many people mention that. I think that's an amazing point for us all to take home. And then I also that point of just observing where there's a difference, isn't there? Because there's nothing threatening to say to someone, are you okay? You're acting slightly different. And I just think that's a good way to start the conversation, isn't it? Because you're not just attacking that person, you're starting the conversation to bring them in. Shannon, we didn't necessarily, forgiveness wasn't one of the main subjects we're going to talk today, but in that scenario, right, let's say someone that is really stressed at home, and let's say they shout at someone at work, and they have that conversation, but the other person still holds that. They're still like, I'm not sure I can work with this person because they've raised their voice to me at work. Is that something can we use the research on forgiveness in that area to move things forward at all?
Yeah, I mean, I think a really key part of forgiveness is kind of understanding that it's for yourself. I know you forgive the other person, but forgiveness is really for you. Forgiveness is about you being able to kind of process the event, and we call it, so there's different fields of research on forgiveness, and in my field we call it a motivational shift from negative thoughts, feelings and behaviors to benign or positive thoughts, feelings and behaviors. And I think that's really kind of being kind to yourself and understanding that it's okay if you don't forgive straight away. It is a process. It's about a motivational shift, and it's more for you than for the other person. Kind of being able to take what happened and still acknowledge I don't believe in forgive or forget. I don't believe in that at all, because I think if you've forgotten, there's nothing to forgive. So it's really important to kind of take the event that happened, process it, being kind to yourself if it takes you a bit of time to get over it, to move past it and move forward. And it's kind of a constant bit of work, but unfortunately because forgiveness is complex, there's not really there's no quick fix for it, unfortunately.
But sorry, Claire.
No, I was just going to say, building on what Shannon said, in that example we've just been talking about, I think the critical element there is empathy. So if the other person that was shouted at, if they don't really understand or are able to put themselves in the other person's shoes, that's going to make it more difficult to move on. So I would probably have a conversation with both of those people individually, and then get them together, create that safe space, and help manage that conversation so that the person that was shouted at can understand a bit more about where that behavior has come from. So encouraging that sort of a rebuild of trust, and encouraging each of them to put themselves in the other's shoes and understand the impact on both on each other.
Wow, I'm going to retract what I said. Every couple needs a Claire. I think every company needs a Claire as well. Next question up. I've been making loads of extra questions of the pre-planned ones, so we're getting nowhere near through the list. But this is so to get a group of experts like this is so interesting for us. What is the impact of relationship stress and breakdown on people's health and work performance?
Well, I'll jump in first. So, I mean, we've been talking about the impact of stress there. You know about the direct read across from kind of relationship stress on work and how that impacts you at work, and then the impact of work stress on home. So yeah, there's a lot that we know about it in terms of people's behavior changes. They can be short-tempered, they can do exactly the scenario that you're talking about there. So we know that the impact is real. It affects your emotional health, it affects your physical health. And in terms of the research, we also know that there's a high percentage of, I think it's around 69% of high earners report relationship breakdown. And 62% of them have said that they know that it's impacted their work, but they haven't spoken to their employer about it. So, we know that there is this, as you've said, what life isn't outside of work, and work isn't outside of home life. And so those two things come up against each other all the time. And I think that as an employer, and certainly, what we do at OnePlusOne, if we can understand each other better, it's it's easier in a small team, 100%.
Yeah.
But, as line managers, if we can understand each other better and understand where they can see that person is displaying, stress, they're stressed, and those behaviors aren't how they usually behave, and they are displaying those stress behaviors. How can you then step in and support them? And I think that missing piece in so many of the conversations is that people don't feel that they can come forward about their relationship stress because of the shame that they have about talking about it. And people sometimes don't even recognize that it's relationship stress that's causing this either, so that's a big thing as well, I think.
Yeah, it's fascinating. Just even the subject of stress is a fascinating subject, isn't it? Because there are some traditional leaders who still think their job is to put stress on the employee, because they have a misconception that means they're going to produce better results. And anyone want to touch on stress specifically?
I think, as we've said, it can manifest in lots of different ways. I mean, I've worked with clients who deal with really, a lot of stress due to relationship breakdown by almost burning out at work. So they throw themselves into work. So on the surface, if the line manager doesn't know them that very well, it would look like they were kind of high performers, but actually that's led to burnout. So I think, if anything, what it's telling us again is how important relationships are, like Verity said. Because, what I say to my coaching clients is, when you're leading a team, you need to know your people. So if you can sense that someone's relationship is not great over time, you can monitor that. But of course, then it's the context of the breakdown, of course, that also matters. I worked with a client the other day who told me that 2 young kids, 6, 9, just husband was a head chef, woke up in the morning to receive a text saying, "That's it, I've left."
Yeah.
So, and that created more of a PTSD reaction, and much stronger, because it was so shocking and so out of the blue. So we have to be prepared for lots of different types of relationship breakdown and lots of different types of stress response.
Yeah.
Can I just, I know we talk so much about relationship breakdown and kind of the negative impact of work on home and on home on work. And but I always, like, as the pro-social relationship researcher, I always like to point out that, like, high relationship quality does lead to higher work engagement. So having a good, solid relationship foundation at home, in your home life, is good for work. It's kind of in the best interests of employers to kind of help their employees have positive home life relationships. So we did some research a while back, and yet we did find that people who reported higher relationship quality at home also reported higher work engagement. And that positive association existed outside of any other kind of work-centric or relationship-centric or socio-demographic factors. Yeah. So regardless of anything, if you've got like a positive, supportive relationship at home, or you're able to, and like kind of Claire's saying, you're able to invest the time in your relationship and, and build that and work on it, it will have a positive impact on home. So I'm a firm believer.
Organisational cultures are really important that promote work-life balance.
Yeah.
If you look at places like Sweden or in Scandinavia, where they have much better kind of paternity leave, you know, that, so that kind of more of a balance and valuing, you know, kind of family and personal relationships. I think that's really important as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm not going to try and speak Danish, but there's a word, it's pronounced something like arbeidsglæde in Danish, and it basically means work happiness. But it doesn't mean work and happiness. It's just a word that they have that is just something that it's just, that's what you should have.
That's so cool.
I like
I've
it.
never heard of that. I love that.
Yeah, it comes out of a lot of that stuff to do with the Little Book of Hugo, which is a book that I recommend people to read. But there's so many great words in Danish that we just don't have here. But we're explaining these things, but we don't necessarily have the vocabulary to talk about them.
It's interesting. I mean, I did my PhD on shame and found out that in China there's 20 different words for shame. So
yeah,
wow,
that is.
We just have, you know, one.
And that's what that's what I always think about, like the research Shannon's talking about, the research that Happiness Index do. We're just observing stuff that humans are feeling, and sometimes we haven't acknowledged it because some of these subjects are taboo. We have 3 minutes to do the last 3 questions, so we're going to go into a quick fire round. This is my fault as a bad host. Why is it still taboo? Who wants to take that? Why can't we talk about if our relationship is really on the rocks at home? Why is it taboo to talk about that at work?
I mean, I want to start by saying I think that relationships, like, they're good, they're bad, they're fluid, they're messy, you know, they involve really core child parts of us. Some, you know, they involve lots of different emotions. I think a lot of the time people just think it's not their business. We work with a lot of practitioners whose business is to work with families, and they still think it's not my business. It's, you know, it's, if you fail in a relationship, Claire was talking about shame there. If you fail in your relationship, it's your fault. It's shame. You know, things like menopause, mental health, things like that, they're objective things that you can't help, as it were. But when your relationship, it kind of holds a bit of a mirror up to you. And if you think you're doing badly in your relationship, then it's your fault, and there's something wrong with you. And I do think that kind of shame around relationships is a really big part of it. And also, you know, as a society, we've kind of idealized relationships, haven't we? Hallmark movies and rom-coms and all that kind of stuff. Disney, you only see the positive side. You don't, as Verity said before, you see the really good at the beginning, and then you see the really awful, and all the stuff in between we just kind of miss, I think. And I think that's a really core part of it. We just don't talk about them enough. Really.
Well, Disney don't even give you that. They just live happily ever after, don't they?
That's also,
But I think the other thing is that we always say, you know, as we've said, is that we can never really know what's going on behind closed doors. We don't.
Absolutely.
It goes back to the fluidity of relationships, and as Verity said, you know, one day we're like, oh, you know, my partner's the best person ever, and then, you know, they're the worst in the world, and that's part of the fluidity of relationships, of emotion. So it's quite hard, I think, on other people to hear that roller coaster, and I that sometimes, so then the other person that they're talking to only hears the last thing they heard. So you know, if someone said something in anger, and then it relate to somebody at work, then that's blown up out of proportion, and they think, well, that's the only thing that person has said. So you get a misperception about the partner and about the relationship. So it's really tough.
On that point, I always had that in my mind, like even when it was lockdown and everyone was told to work from home, and we were thinking about what our work, and it's easy for the Happiness Index to go virtual, but we retained employees' right to use work life, which is where I am now, because I always think in my head, for everything from domestic violence to mental health, you don't know what someone's going at home. So if you can create, it doesn't mean you have to have an office, but if you can create a safe space for an employee to leave the home, that's just, I'm just sharing for other companies, that's something I always kept in my mind. But we've got 2 minutes, 2 questions. What can employers do to help equip line managers to spot signs of someone who may be facing relationship stress, and to reach out to them to offer support? That's a tough question. I don't know who wants to take that in 60 seconds.
I'll try. I mean, this is going back to, you know, sorting out first and foremost the culture. So, you know, create an open culture, and have the difficult conversation. Don't push it. Be patient. Know your people. Understand what stress looks like on your people. Also, I mean, you know, understand the different, develop an understanding of the different changes and stages in relationships, and the triggers that can form, that can kind of impact relationships. Transition to parenthood, that's a big one. Moving house, you know, having a child with additional needs, like Shannon said. All of those things are really, really important. And, you know, learning about those things. We've got some training, relationship conversations, which helps you to develop that context and understanding. But first and foremost, it's got to be about the culture.
Yeah, absolutely. Brings us to the last question. What emotional and practical support can employees offer outside the traditional EAP? I think that's an employee assistance program, if we're going to get rid of the acronyms, to support their people. Anyone want to take that in 30 seconds?
Culture again, and
yeah,
you know, possibly a kind of more of a mindset shift around encouraging organisations to allow every couple to have an annual health check. So
yeah,
what we've been talking about earlier, you know, to catch it early,
Mm.
make it more preventative rather than crisis led.
That's it. I would say
Yeah.
that it's that, you know, often it can take 6 to 7 years, we know, for someone to reach out for relationship counselling. So if your EAP has got relationship counselling,
sorry, Verity, did you
that's
say
great.
6 to 7 years?
6 to 7 years,
That's
yeah.
unbelievable, isn't it?
Yeah. So we're in this early intervention space because we're in that kind of preventative, you know, we recognize where these things can happen. We can do things that can improve relationships and strengthen them before they get to that stage. So as an employer, you know, don't let it get to that stage for the people that you're supporting and that you're working with.
Yep.
Give them some stuff to help them to build those strong foundations early. Yeah.
Cool. We've got -1 minute, but I'm going to add 2 extra questions in because I really want to add them in really quickly, and I'm going to just everyone talk really fast. Shannon, what's the most piece of interesting research you've read in this area recently, and where can we go and read it?
Oh my goodness, I don't know if I can answer that. I read so much every day. Do you know what? On topic, I've been reading a lot about dads recently, and I read a piece of research recently that basically said that dads can suffer postnatal depression in the same way that mums can. And I think it is critically important that we do more around paternity leave and allowing dads to be involved more in things like health checkups, with, you know, in perinatal health checkups and things like that. We know that health visitors don't really engage with dads because dads tend to be at work when they come to meet baby, because mum's on maternity leave, but dad isn't. So I don't have the research with me, but I can find it. And
we'll send it in the email. We'll send it in the follow-up email. I
find it really I think there's a real need to involve dads more, and to as workplaces to support dads to be more involved early on.
Love that. And Verity, I've got one final question for you. I love what OnePlusOne do, but for those that have listened and thought, oh, this is some interesting stuff, what is OnePlusOne in terms of where we can access some resources? Do we go to a website? Should we add you on LinkedIn? Like, if we want to find out more about OnePlusOne, what's the way to do it?
Yeah, I mean, we've got our OnePlusOne website, which you can go to. We also have a website called Click Relationships, which is there. It's got a kind of community forum on there, supported by our expert articles. So people can go and, you know, sort of post about what's going on in their relationship, but also read the expert articles around the kind of what we know about the relationship science, but turning it into something that's really easy to understand and hopefully help you in your kind of day-to-day life. So yeah, 2 places.
Brilliant. Go and check them out. And also, if you want to understand what your culture feels and looks like in your organization, go to thehappinessindex.com and book a demo. But last but not least, I have to say, Claire, Verity and Shannon, I learned so much today, and I had fun and enjoyed it in this really tough subject. So I hope our listeners did too. And if any questions come through, send them through and we'll direct them to the appropriate person. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.